Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. The new year has finally come. Some North Korean watchers say the year 2021 can be described as stagnation in the U.S.-North Korea relations, as the North Korean regime does not respond to the U.S. offer to talk. As we look ahead into the year 2022, what can we expect in the geopolitics surrounding North Korea? Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Noerper, president of the Honolulu-based Asia Dialogue with an eye to Korea and Northeast Asia. Dr. Noerper also serves as an adjunct research scholar at Columbia University and an advisor to the United Nations Program on Northeast Asia. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Young-Kyo.
Toward the end of the year 2021, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un presided the plenary meeting of the Workers' Party. The latest meeting was the fourth of its kind and also the longest of its kind. Kim Jong-un seemed to be putting efforts in these meetings last year. Dr. Noerper, does this reflect the urgency he's feeling?
Well, it reflects his urgency around the economy and ever-tightening. Certainly his focus on the pandemic and its impact, both in terms of the threat to public health, should there be a spread, which they deny, as well as the economic cost of that, the pull down at the borders of the curtain, so really significantly reduced trade with China and other partners. And of course, on top of the pandemic, on top of the economic downturn, you have natural disasters. So that has created his call for serious belt tightening and the talk of some urgency over the course of this next year in what he describes as what will be a difficult year for North Korea.
Mr. Snyder, why did Kim Jong-un have to hold these meetings more frequently this year?
Well, I think the positive spin on more frequent party meetings is that it shows that in contrast to his father, who rarely held these kind of party meetings and really governed through the military commission, we see the regularization of the party apparatus, and we see the use of the party as an instrument for political control and for governance. But I think the negative side of it is, as Steve has suggested, there are serious problems internally. And I think that the priority is really on maintaining political loyalty. And one way of doing that is having more frequent meetings as opportunities for high-ranking cadres to demonstrate loyalty and also to maintain political control over what is happening internally. So this is the fourth one since the Eighth Party Congress in January. And that stands in pretty stark contrast to the frequency of meetings during the period of the Seventh Party Congress.
Based on what has been revealed so far through North Korea's state media, Kim Jong-un said all the participants of the plenary meeting will face a grave challenge this year, just like last year, and that they will have to be responsible. And the state media also reported that the plenary meeting discussed the inter-Korean relations and foreign strategies. Mr. Snyder, do you expect to see anything different this year?
Well, unfortunately, at the beginning of 2020, I was predicting a prolonged stalemate in U.S.-North Korea relations, and I think that that prediction has come to pass. The other takeaway, I think, from the coverage that we've seen so far of the plenary meeting was the emphasis primarily on the rural problem, which suggests to me that Kim Jong-un's main priority really is to try to fix the food challenges and the internal agricultural challenges that North Korea currently faces.
The plenary meeting put a lot of emphasis on the economy as well. And at the same time, Kim Jong-un said the urgent quarantine should be at the top of the country's priority. Dr. Noerper, under these circumstances, will North Korea be able to improve its economy?
Well, it seems very difficult without envisioning some sort of opening, right? And that may well happen with China, could potentially with Russia. But things like vaccine diplomacy will be very important. There seems to be a distrust or a distance relative to Sinovac, maybe a wait and see on Sputnik. But for the immediate near term, difficult. And I would really think that it's the latter part of next year when we would see any sort of opening. I think everybody is in a wait and see mode, and everyone is focused domestically, not only the North Koreans, but certainly every other aspect of those players in Northeast Asia and the United States looking inward at the pandemic and economic costs. But that's not an invitation to sit back on laurels. It's an invitation to really think creatively about how to re-engage once they do reemerge.
Mr. Snyder?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not North Korea's clear economic need is going to generate prospects for positive diplomacy. And the reason is really because we've seen in the 1990s when North Korea faced the famine and a lot of economic difficulties internally, they did come out to international meetings if they got paid. But what they didn't do is to negotiate quid pro quos under those circumstances. And so for that reason, I think that even though it's true that vaccine diplomacy might be a good catalyst to try to get something started, I think that when North Korea refers to an unstable external economic environment as being a barrier to its foreign relations, it also means that the possible instability internally is a barrier to relations in the sense that it's very hard for external diplomacy to be pursued when there are pressing priorities internally.
I'm wondering, if the regime is really serious about improving its economy, Mr. Snyder, shouldn't it think again about their own nuclear and missile programs?
Well, yes, it should, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will. It's complicated. I think that it's unlikely that we're going to see as aggressive a push in terms of especially provocative military developments as we might have otherwise. But we also have to recall that Kim Jong-un's main focus is on demonstrating his legitimacy as a leader, and the military development in the absence of economic progress remains the central platform for accomplishments that he can point to when North Korea has these kinds of large-scale party meetings.
I think Scott's right. The domestic impetus around that is tremendous, and that really influences a lot of the foreign and strategic policy making. And it really behooves us to think about how to incentivize or transmit the message to the North Koreans, not only on the part of the United States or South Korea, but also players like China and Russia, that nuclear development is not in North Korea's long-term interest. It doesn't provide the security which they seek, but rather the way out is through demilitarization and a downtick in those capabilities. But to Kim Jong-un consolidating, continuously dealing with different actors who demand some level of accountability, dealing with younger North Koreans who are interested in mobility and mobile phones and a better standard of living, trying to get to the economic solutions will be very difficult. And then trying to keep the distractor of military development away and off the board really is of urgency for every player in the region.
Last year, the US kept saying it is open to talks with North Korea, but North Korea didn't respond at all. Mr. Snyder, do you expect to see some change in North Korea's position this year? Because I know you've been very skeptical.
Yeah, and I'm remaining skeptical for at least the first half of the year, because I think that the North Koreans are going to want to see how the situation develops around the South Korean presidential election and how the Biden administration interacts with the new leadership in South Korea before it's likely to reach out and make any moves. And I think that the relative downplaying of an emphasis on foreign policy in the statements coming out of the plenum reflect that uncertainty and desire to wait and learn a little bit more about the external environment before conducting any diplomatic outreach.
Dr. Noerper, will there be any event that could be marked as an inflection point in the U.S.-North Korea relations?
Well, certainly there could be a few different possibilities. One is if we see any sort of leveraging through negotiations, some sort of economic assistance or other package put forward, whether that's from the United States, whether that is with the current Moon administration or with the Yoon or Lee administration after May of next year. Certainly in the case of an uptick in military activity, and something like a satellite launch might not rise to the level of tremendous concern. However, long-range ballistic missile tests that were clear and definable would put the military issue back on board, but at the same time would undercut Chinese and Russian leverage to decrease sanctions on North Korea. So that would be a very dangerous gamble for North Korea. And North Korea has kept its long-range missile moratorium in place. That's not to discount the short and medium-term tests that have raised so much concern over this last year. But they're trying to keep things under a threshold. So those would be the type of markers: movement on the economic offering and diplomatic front, or movement relative to security concerns.
The U.S. State Department says it has made it clear through both their public messaging and private messaging that the U.S. are ready, willing, and able to engage in diplomacy with North Korea, and says it continues to hope North Korea will respond positively to that outreach. Dr. Noerper, will the U.S. maintain its stance this year, or will it take a little bit different approach?
Well, I think that the tendency, given the distractions on the Biden administration by the issues we've mentioned, like the pandemic, economy, racial injustice in the United States, as well as some very significant other foreign policy issues, Ukraine, Iran, others, mean that the Korea factor is a bit further down on the agenda. That said, though, there's an invitation to think more creatively about a new North Korea policy, one that expands a bit more in terms of its offering. Not just talks anytime, anywhere, but putting something definable in front of North Koreans in terms of letting them see an incentivization to scale back and very particular markers on that field. Perhaps this is a time for people to get together and talk about contingencies and talk about opportunities at the table if they're putting them forward. I don't mean to sound naive. There's respective national interests at play here. But certainly within the context of the US-ROK relationship, and it needs to be on the broader regional agenda. And so we need to place that back on during this period when we are, unfortunately, given the health crisis, inwardly focused.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think? Will the U.S. take more actions to draw North Korea into talks?
I think the dilemma the Biden administration really has is that, okay, it's nice that they've reached out and indicated a willingness to talk, but it's also true that North Korea is a low priority. It appears to be a low priority for the Biden administration. So there's a risk that by not being more active, the Biden administration is giving North Korea the incentive to use provocations to push itself onto the agenda. And yet, at the same time, I think it's pretty clear from what North Korea has said that economic incentives or economic cooperation as a catalyst for pursuing diplomacy alone is not going to be sufficient. It's going to be necessary to find a way to address in some form the quote unquote hostile policy perceptions that North Korea has. And so I think that means that the Biden administration may need to lean forward a little bit more in terms of addressing issues related to North Korean security, but they don't want to do it in such a way that they feel like they're losing the economic leverage that they feel they have accrued through imposition of sanctions. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see whether the Biden administration can come to terms with the dilemma and the difficulty that it faces, especially in the context of North Korea's economic privation.
Dr. Noerper, do you agree that the Biden administration has put low priority on North Korean issues?
Well, I would say lower priority than a lot of the other issues on the table. And Scott's exactly right. But look, we need to move to a different type of playing field here. And that means that we need all actors, including the United States, to be thinking creatively about how to get to a new place. And we'll see what prioritization is placed on inter-Korean relations relative to the Yoon or Lee administration. But the fact of the matter is we're in a unification tunnel. So the timing, the pacing may be different depending on the next administration. And certainly there may be a legacy to the Moon administration, and we may not have seen the end of offers quite yet before the March elections. But it's important to at least raise the possibility of where we can establish forward movement on issues like demilitarization, on issues like green concerns, on issues of new technologies, and try to approach them through a level that may not be as high and as glamorous as what many seek, but which may be incremental and very pragmatic in terms of providing levels of confidence to do what Scott has just hinted at, remedy 70 years of distrust. And overcoming that trust deficit is going to take time, a significant amount of time, and a great deal of creative thinking.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that the Biden administration is treating North Korea with a low priority, but I think that it's safe to say that the North Korea policy, as it has unfolded this far, appears to be insufficient to achieve the objectives the Biden administration has set for itself.
U.S. also maintains China is an important actor in resolving the North Korean issue. Dr. Noerper, if by any chance the U.S. and China improve their relationship this year, will it have a spillover effect on North Korea?
Oh, of course. When China-U.S. relations are better, situation around the peninsula is better. And so it is very clear that there could be better forward progress. But that's not to say the many concerns and the contest that has evolved so dramatically between China and the United States prohibits cooperation on this front. China ultimately wants stability around the Korean Peninsula, and they want that to keep the Northeast flank calm, right? Especially given concerns territorially in all other directions for China by their own definition. And so things like missile or nuclear testing by North Korea draw the Americans in and also concern the Chinese on a strategic level, as well as in terms of environmental impact and, of course, the prospect for things like mishap. So China wants stability, and the United States wants stability on the peninsula. So perhaps there's a common bridge that can be articulated over time. There need to be discussions around the peninsula, and even if medium and long-term strategic objectives may differ and may differ dramatically on the part of the Americans and Chinese, at least in the near term, there needs to be better multilateral cooperation.
Mr. Snyder, how important is the role of China in influencing North Korea?
Well, it's important, but I want to address China-U.S. strategic mistrust because I've often said that North Korea lives in the space created by U.S.-China strategic mistrust, and by that measure, North Korea should be able to build a mansion. But it's also the case that China by itself does not have the tools necessary to solve the Korean Peninsula problem. China appears to be able to keep bad things from happening by providing aid to North Korea and things like that, but it has not found a way and does not appear to have the capacity on its own to create a pathway toward peace and normalization of relations between the two Koreas.
I think to add to that, Young-Yo, you know, I think the perception, and it's really a misperception among many strategists away from the Korean Peninsula, is that Beijing pulls the lever on Pyongyang. That's not really the case. I mean, the history of Korean nationalism, and in particular, some of the sentiments expressed privately by North Koreans relative to China, mean that there's work ahead. But there is, as Scott has pointed out, some evident things that can be done to restrain them, but often not things that can be done to cause proactive behavior.
This is my last question for today. With only a few months left in office, the Moon administration is holding tightly onto its hope for the end of war declaration. South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong said South Korea and the U.S. have already reached a de facto agreement on the draft of the declaration. Mr. Snyder, we've been talking about this for a while now. Has it come closer to realization?
Well, what was striking to me actually was the Biden administration's silence in response to Foreign Minister Chung's statement. And that suggests to me that even if the two sides reach some kind of public agreement about an end of war statement in some form or fashion, it's likely to be highly conditioned on North Korean performance in one way or another. And I think that the effect of that is going to be to render any statement moot and to push a discussion of how to coordinate into the next Korean administration.
Dr. Noerper, same question for you. Will the end of war declaration be realized?
I mean, unlikely between now and the Moon administration's departure. However, the sentiment is what is important, and that can be continued in different guises under peace regime or other type of descriptors. There's a separate issue of where the U.S. and South Korea lie relative to support for end of war. But the statement that the foreign minister has also made is that there's de facto or tacit acceptance, and President Moon made that statement alongside Prime Minister Morrison in Australia as well. And so there seems to be an acknowledgement of tacit acceptance by the United States and by China, for that matter. In early December, the National Security Advisor went from Seoul to Tianjin to meet with the Chinese head of the party foreign office to try to secure that. But they're not priorities. The prioritization was really with the Moon administration. So where the priority is for the Lee or the Yoon administration will be interesting to see. But the broader calculus of being in that unification tunnel and trying to find ways to move forward creatively on doing away with the trust deficit and building confidence should be the lasting story of this push for an end of war declaration or statement.
Mm-hmm. The year 2022 has arrived. The U.S. continues to stress that it is prepared to meet with North Korea without preconditions. Apparently, it is up to North Korea and its leader Kim Jong-un if the engagement between the U.S. and North Korea is actually to take place. We'll have to watch closely whether the year 2022 will be different from the previous year. Mr. Snyder and Dr. Noerper, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.